Love Bristol. Love BCFM 93.2.
Now, Martin, we have a couple of bombings yesterday, one in southern Pakistan and in Baghdad. It almost seems like the news people are putting them in pairs now so that we don't realise or we don't see that they're so... incredibly... This is almost becoming normalised, isn't it? In Baghdad, 50 people die. In Pakistan, another 50 people die, so they do it in one bulletin. 100 people died today in bomb attacks.
Well, I remember reading about this yesterday and thinking how sad it was that we've become absolutely inured now to the fact that there are going to be bomb attacks. It was a bomb attack on a Sufi shrine in Pakistan and on a Shia... I think it was a car auction in Baghdad. And that's a result of our warmongering policies over many, many years.
Well, why do you blame us?
Why not? Why do I blame us? Well, we can discuss later who really finances ISIS. We discussed that. You hinted at the top of the hour that we might discuss that. But don't forget that the militant Islamic movement that has emerged, which ostensibly carries out these atrocities, was trained, armed, and directed by Western intelligence services from the 1980s onwards in Afghanistan, which has now caused knock-on problems in Pakistan, which have been going on for decades. And, of course, there were no car bombs in Iraq before we invaded in 2003. There hardly any.
I noticed nobody who was talking to Tony Blair about remaining or Remoaning or Remaniacs today. Nobody seemed to say, well, how have you managed to skip jail, Tony? Because you should be in jail, you're a war criminal. They were all just, nobody seems to ask him these tough questions.
Well, no, because, basically he's beyond that, and so is George Bush, and so is lots of other people. And
it does make you wonder.
We shouldn't just pick on Tony Blair. I mean, Tony Blair...
Well, it's just because he's been in the news today.
Well, indeed, but I mean, there's lots of other people who should be in jail. The people who set up Al-Qaeda in the 1980s, that's Margaret Thatcher, by the way, and Ronald Reagan. They set it up. And there will be...
Well, they're both dead.
There'll be retired military personnel from Britain who were involved in those in setting up Al-Qaeda. They've certainly not been prosecuted, have they? They're talking in Northern Ireland now about the question of what they're going to do with these investigations that are still ongoing. And James Brokenshire, the Northern Ireland secretary, is saying, well, the police seem to be concentrating too much on the army and they're trying to rewrite history. Now, the fact is that British military personnel have been involved in terrorism for decades, and not a single one of them has gone to prison. Not even Brigadier Gordon Kerr, who the head of the Metropolitan Police, Sir John Stevens, definitely fingered as behind the Force Research Unit, which was involved in hundreds of murders in Northern Ireland. He is actually on a pension. We are paying his pension. And I presume he's also still active in the privatised military industry.
OK, Donald Trump this week accused Iran. This is as Netanyahu came to visit him, the Israeli Prime Minister, came to visit him in the White House. He accused Iran of seeking to develop nuclear weapons.
Well, there's no evidence for that whatsoever, as we know. But there's been all sorts of... But I have to make this point. If Iran was to develop nuclear weapons, it would be a perfectly straightforward response to Israel's possession of over 200 nuclear warheads, completely illegally. They haven't signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if Britain, who doesn't have any enemies that want to attack us with nuclear weapons, is allowed to have nuclear weapons, why the hell isn't Iran? Although the Iranians themselves, because of their religious beliefs, don't believe in the possession of nuclear weapons. Well, and in a sense, they're right. There's no point having them.
Let me just point out, because a programme called The Cook Report, the episode Dirty Bomb, which aired on Tuesday evening, the 13th of July 1993, in that programme, Roger Cook investigated the availability of former Soviet weapons-grade plutonium and thermonuclear weapons on the Russian black market. He was offered, all filmed by a hidden camera, both weapons-grade plutonium, which was tested by Minatom, which is the Russian Atomic Energy Authority, and thermonuclear weapons from an SS-20 ballistic missile and a complete missile, all crated up. Now, these SS-20 contain MIRVed warheads, which are each 150 kiloton hydrogen bomb. So if Roger Cook was offered these in 1993 and filmed the whole thing and transmitted it, a programme which was later apparently wiped by Carlton TV, surely the Iranians and others could quite easily get hold of these on the black market in the early 1990s.
All right, well, 2 points. First of all, the warhead is no use at all unless you've got a missile to put it on.
Well, and he's talking about an SS-20 missile
Yes, no, but I
system.
mean, the Iranians have got more advanced missiles than the SS-20 now for non-nuclear warheads, okay? So they've got missiles. But they're entitled to have missiles. There's no rule against them saying, no, we've got missiles. Are we not entitled to have missiles? They're entitled to have missiles. We're entitled to have them. They're entitled to have them. There is no evidence, not a shred of evidence, that the Iranians bought any such missiles.
Okay, hang on, Martin, because...
Why are you saying the Iranians have bought these missiles?
If Roger Cook, the reporter, can get access to these SS-20s, each of which, I say, has 3 warheads, the range is several thousand miles, then surely any state in the world or Secret Service is going to have access if Roger Cook can get it.
But in that case, why pick on the Iranians? It could be the Saudis.
Yes.
Okay, so but why the Iranians?
Well, the point being here that the Iranians are just one country who could have got their hands on these nukes.
Well, in other words,
Ukraine.
there's a real problem here with nuclear proliferation, but it's not related to Iran at all, is it? Iran is just another country that might have bought some weapons. There's plenty of repressive countries in the world which might have bought those weapons. Many of them, I mean, I've mentioned Saudi Arabia because they're friends of the Israelis, might supply them with a nuclear weapon. And they might even use it on Iran. And then if you were the Iranian general staff, you might think, well, we might need stuff. Now, in actual fact, the Iranians have said all along, we haven't got them. The North Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese as they now are, they haven't got them either. And they were threatened with nuclear attack by Nixon and Kissinger during the war. And they turned around and said, go on then, attack us. You can nuke us if you like, but you know what? You're bluffing. We're going to defeat you on the ground, and General Giap and the Vietnamese army did defeat the Americans on the ground. They thrashed them. And the Americans didn't dare to use nuclear weapons because they just didn't dare. And ultimately, nuclear weapons don't protect you. If you're going to use, anybody who uses nuclear weapons is setting off on an uncontrollable escalation situation. So if any country was to use nuclear weapons, other countries would start using theirs. So in other words, they're irrelevant to the military balance.
The private military company Blackwater advertised on their website that we can run and win a nuclear war.
Well, that's their delusion. They haven't done it. They haven't done so, have they? That's just their sales pitch. I'd rather have General Giap than Eric Prince. Eric Prince has never won anything. General Giap thrashed the United States of America using conventional methods.
So, is it wrong?
As they deserved.
Is it wrong then for Trump to accuse Iran of seeking to develop nuclear weapons?
He's got no evidence. There's no evidence whatsoever. There's never been any evidence. What Trump should be saying to Netanyahu is, hang on a minute, you've got nuclear weapons which you stole from us. And you actually stole our nuclear secrets and sold them to the Russians. Jonathan Powell was put in prison for doing exactly that. Now, ultimately, we might say to the Israelis, who we know possess nuclear weapons through subterfuge, we say, no, you put those nuclear weapons, you give us all of them, all of your warheads, or we're going to invade Israel and we're going to put you under occupation until you hand over those nuclear weapons.
The Israelis neither confirm nor deny that they've got any nuclear weapons.
We know that they've got them. We know that they're lying. And in fact, what we could say, and in actual fact, there's on the statute book in the United States of America, it's very clear. Any country which has got nuclear weapons, which is not supposed to have them, think Israel, we're not supposed to do any kind of aid, trade, or any kind of business with them, which is why they why they deny that they've got them, or won't confirm or deny. But everybody knows that Dimona, Mordecai Vienu exposed it, they've got them. Now, you could argue that the United Nations, the Russians and the Americans together, should invade Israel and say, you hand over those nuclear weapons, or we're going to occupy your country and we're going to take them off you.
Well, you just mentioned Vanunu there. It was interesting that the Sunday Times published that, the Insight team, that story about Vanunu, and then Rupert Murdoch took it over and sacked all the best journalists and photojournalists from the Sunday Times.
Indeed. So when we're talking about nuclear weapons, let's talk about somebody who has got them, the Israelis. And Martin von Creveld, who is a defence intellectual, I think they call him in Israel, he said, what our enemies have got to understand is that we've got nuclear weapons. And that goes for all the countries in Europe. If they try and tell us what to do, we can attack Rome and Berlin. He said that. That's on the record.
The other thing is, with the Roger Cook programme, people may wonder whatever happened to Roger Cook, who's not very well at the moment, I understand. Thoughts and prayers are with him. But Roger, as part of his programme, he had a sting campaign against that programme in 2000 in the News of the World, which then shut that programme down. Effectively, it was taken off the air and it's never come back. But again, that's a Murdoch operation that shut Roger Cook down.
Well, indeed. So, in other words, lots of phony scares are being used to scare us. Ooh, what about the Iranians with nuclear weapons? And the real problems of people with nuclear weapons are not even covered because we don't do the investigative journalism anymore that we used to do.
It almost sounds like Rupert Murdoch's working directly for the Israelis to shut down investigations.
He's pretty pro-Israel, and he's also got shares in the company which is going to develop the oil and gas in the Golan Heights.
Is this Genie Energy, by any chance?
Yes, that's right. Although it's completely illegal because the Golan Heights are occupied illegally by the Israelis.
Just tell us a little bit about the history of the Golan Heights. Wasn't it 1967 that they were taken over?
It was the 73 war.
I thought the 73 war was to take them back.
All right, well, yeah, you may be right.
Yeah.
But the point is that the Golan Heights are officially part of Syria. And, of course, the Golan Heights are now being used by the Israeli Defense Force to supply and support the al-Nusra Front, who are operating against the Syrian Arab army in that region. And there's photographs of them taking people, jihadi fighters in, and giving them medical attention, and also supplying them with weapons and other things. Now, in other words, the Israelis and the Western powers are the supporters of the al-Nusra Front in Syria, and they have been from the very beginning. Meanwhile, we're told we've got to go to war to defeat the al-Nusra al-Qaeda front, but at the same time we're arming and training them, and our Israeli allies are arming and training them. I think that's the Israelis are really reaching a position now where you could say, A, you shouldn't really be recognising the United Nations as an independent state because you're not fulfilling your obligations as an independent state. And secondly, you've got nuclear weapons, you're not supposed to have them. Maybe it's time for us to go to war with you unless you give up your nuclear weapons, because you're a threat not just to the Arab world, you're a threat to us. And maybe it's time for us to sort that out.
Well, I'm guessing that wasn't the conversation that took place in the White House this week.
I'm sure it
with
wasn't.
Benjamin Netanyahu. So let's have a listen now to Trump as part of that joint conference, really talking about US policy towards Israel, particularly on whether he thinks a one or two state solution would be a good idea, and also on the shifting of the capital, which would really be the US embassy moving and all other embassies, I imagine, following from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
I thought for a while the two-state looked like it may be the easier of the two. But honestly, if Bibi and if the Palestinians, if Israel and the Palestinians are happy, I'm happy with the one they like the best. As far as the embassy moving to Jerusalem, I'd love to see that happen. We're looking at it very, very strongly. We're looking at it with great care, believe me. And we'll see what happens. Okay?
Martin, I suppose the one or two state solution, this is an old chestnut here, but he's saying, look, I think it's just up to the Palestinians and the Israeli government to decide.
Except that the Palestinians have said that you're not asking what we think at all, are you? I mean, the official Palestinian position is that they still want a two-state solution. That's the al-Fatah position. Hamas are saying, well, maybe it's too late for a two-state solution. Maybe we're just going to have to deconstruct the state of Israel, full stop. Full stop. And, of course, you could then have a one state, which would be called Israel-Palestine, with one citizenship, in which the Arabs would have a majority, and it wouldn't be a Jewish state. The Jews would be a minority within that state. And, of course, when you've got an Arab majority within that one state, they can then have an immigration policy similar to Trump's, where we're saying no Jews from outside this can come in here because you've got too many people here already.
What about moving the capital, though?
Well, that's
this really is controversial,
that's
isn't
provocative
it? Because our whole idea originally was that East Jerusalem would be Arab. The Arabs were pretty much kicked out in the 67 war. At least the military, the Syrians and the Jordanians and the Egyptians, for example, were kicked out in the 67 war. So it looks as if Trump is supporting the idea of Jerusalem being a Jewish capital, which in a way, I mean, surely the Jewish people, as Netanyahu would say, for thousands of years have been wanting this. Well,
I'll just point out that in 1948, the State of Israel was recognised on the understanding that the capital will be Tel Aviv. Now, in other words, if you don't want to recognise that was the understanding in 1948. If you change that, then you lose your right to be represented at the United Nations. Kosovo isn't represented at the United Nations. Crimea isn't represented at the United Nations. Catalonia isn't. Scotland isn't. Israel could be de-recognised. If you don't play by the rules, you're going to be de-recognised. And we say that to everybody else all over the world. There is no independent Tamil state in the north of Sri Lanka. There's all these things that all these rules apply to everybody. There's no independent Kashmir inside India. I mean, we could say, well, on the basis of your professed position, which is that you don't want to accept all the rules and regulations, including where your capital is, maybe Israel should be de-recognised. And beyond that, I would go so far as to say that we may be in a position where we're eventually going to have to go to war with Israel because we're not happy with their positions.
OK, what about the sacking of Michael Flynn, National Security Advisor, we heard about this time last week? Because he was definitely an advocate for, in fact, he was so enthusiastic to have a rapprochement with Russia that he was chatting to the ambassador before he'd even been appointed, apparently.
Are you asking me about... Oh, well, I think this is all... what's happened here is that the only progressive point in Donald Trump's platform was that he was going to talk sensibly with the Russians. And, of course, Flynn's resignation, it's a forced resignation, really. The FBI bugged the phone call, and all he did was saying, we'll chat when we're... Because, don't forget, by that stage, Trump had already won. He didn't win the most votes, but he'd won the rigged electoral system inside the US. It's perfectly reasonable for him to chat to the Russian ambassador. But, of course, this has been used as an excuse to get rid of him. I mean, I'm no friend of Flynn's. He's one of the people who's saying we've got to go to war with Iran. So, in many ways, the fact that he's been thrown under a bus is probably quite good from an Iranian point of view. But the fact is that Trump's being told we're not doing that, we're doing this, and he's gone along with it because he's basically a puppet of the military-industrial complex and the Zionist lobby, just as the previous presidents have been. And he's no different. He's slightly more dangerous because he's more belligerent, but not really that much more dangerous. He just comes out with stuff in public that people used to say in private. And the reality is that we've got a very dangerous administration, both in Israel and in the US, which are dead set on war. And, of course, they may get what they want, but they may not like it when they get there.
Yeah, I mentioned it at the top of the hour, the Arab Spring, as part of Dialect next Tuesday lunchtime. There's well, I found it interesting anyway, interview with a guy called Scott Bennett, who's a former psychological warfare officer. Now, Martin, one of the things he uncovered as part of his work was the terrorist bank accounts at UBS in Switzerland. And it struck me during the week, because I put out a scan, actually, of part of Milton Schulman, his book, Marilyn, Hitler and Me, which was published in the 1990s, contains a whole chapter on the kidnapping or the rescue, some would say, of Hitler's treasurer Martin Bormann from Berlin in 1945, and he describes the whole fight, really, in a way, to get this book finally published in the 1990s, written by John Ainsworth Davis, and he was a commando involved in this raid to get Bormann out. And it was striking for me, what Scott Bennett was saying was about the crucial role of UBS Bank in Switzerland back in the Second World War in helping finance the Nazi gold, basically a Nazi recrudescence after the Second World War, and today the money's coming mostly from the Gulf states of Saudi Arabia, but including the US as well, he believes, and then going to ISIS and to fund these Takfiri groups in the Middle East, particularly in Syria and in Iraq.
Well, anybody who pays attention knows that this is what's going on. Fundamentalist Sunni terrorism has been used as a tool of Western policy since the 1980s. Everybody admits that they used to do it, but then they say, but we lost control of Al-Qaeda. Now, I don't believe that for a minute. The Al-Qaeda groups or affiliated groups operating inside Syria have intimate, practical military links with the Israeli Defence Forces and with the Turkish Defence Forces and with British and American Defence Forces. The Iranians know that. The Russian general staff know that. Those who follow these things and who listen to this show over the last 8 years will know that. But I'm afraid the vast majority of the public are blissfully unaware that they're being lied to by criminals and terrorists.
So let's have a listen now to Scott Bennett, and I'll put a link up on the show page to this fascinating tale by Milton Schulman. It was just a whole chapter. In fact, it's his memoirs. He was a Canadian-born Jewish film critic in London and theatre critic for many years for the Evening Standard. But then he played a great part in getting this book finally published. The thing I found so fascinating about much of this, though, Martin, is that at the time that this book was published, there was what you would probably call a spoiler book published, which was called The Search for Martin Bormann. At the same time, which was all about how they searched for him, but they never found him because he died just outside the bunker. And then also since then, we've had these books, Grey Wolf. There's various other ones. Jerome Corsi has written one as well, which purport not that Martin Bormann survived, but that Hitler survived and lived for many years in Argentina, etc., etc.
Well, I don't know. These do sound like spoiler books to me. I think the evidence suggests that Bormann was rescued by a British team and then
there were also some
John Ainsworth Davis wrote the book about the rescue of Bormann.
Yeah, well, he also had corroborating letters from Winston Churchill. He had corroborating letters from Ian Fleming, who was also involved in this raid, and he also had a corroborating letter from Louis Mountbatten as well, who was also. So I mean, it's very difficult to refute this, but there were still big attempts to, and many of the publishers pulled out at the last minute because they wouldn't publish the book.
Well, that's right, because in actual fact, when NATO was founded in the 1940s, the Nazi intelligence structure was taken over lock, stock and barrel and basically integrated into NATO's planning and command at that stage.
It was key to get Bormann because the Swiss basically said to the British, look, if you want access to all this massive loot from the Second World War, you need to have the signatory. You must have Bormann himself.
Indeed. And of course, at that stage, NATO began from the very beginning as a clandestine organisation working with former Nazis. And that's why they've carried out these Nazi propaganda, psychological warfare techniques with such gusto, including, false flag attacks, supporting jihadi terrorists and then claiming to be against them and all the rest of it. This is all from the Nazi psychological warfare playbook.
Scott Bennett's book is called The Shell Game, which is all about what he discovered as a psychological warfare officer about terrorist funding, which was then ignored by the media in the US and by the politicians over there. But you can read it if you want, and we'll hear now from him. This is Scott Bennett talking about the Arab Spring and how when he was working at the RAND Corporation, it was a psychological operation they cooked up there.
The Arab Spring was just one big psychological warfare product engineered by the CIA. I was there at the RAND Corporation when they were planning it, so I can say it with absolute authority. I can also say I've interviewed people like James and Joanne Moriarty, who were in Libya as Americans, and provided people like Michael Flynn and the CIA with all of the intelligence they needed, that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were state funders with Hillary Clinton of all of these mercenaries to come into Libya, overthrow Gaddafi, steal the gold, steal the natural resources, base an Israeli base up in the mountains. And since then, we've had the fall of Libya and millions upon millions of Africans and Muslim Islamic people flood up into Europe. So the European invasion by the Muslim population is really the fruit of the American policy and the British policy under Cameron, as well as Tony Blair, and the French policy under Sarkozy. But there are some striking examples of treason and cover-up that should be examined, such as the fact that American politicians and I think European politicians were paid $10 million to appear and give positive comments and take photographs with the rebels. And that $10 million came from the $500 billion that was stolen from the Libyan economy. Libya was described as a bank, as a country, but it was really just one single autonomous bank. It was not connected, to any of the globalist banks, the Rothschild banks, and the tentacles of some of these organizations through the Council of Foreign Relations and the Bilderbergs and others.
So he's talking about Libya as a giant bank that was just this sounds like almost like a hostile takeover rather than taking over a country.
Well, that's right. They were basically trying to set up the Libyan gold dinar because they had got big gold reserves which had all been stolen, and they were going to create alternative currency set up to the one dominated by the dollar.
I don't know if you noticed what he said there is an Israeli camp up in the mountains facilitating the overthrow of Gaddafi.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. They're working very closely with the Al-Nusra front just over the border in Syria from the Golan Heights, which they're occupying illegally, as the Syrians well know.
OK, we're going to have to skip the prefabs thing, folks. We'll do a proper job for you next week on the last show before I go away, because I'm off to New Zealand during March with Kevin Carr, who will be here next week. But a couple of final stories. Paris riots 20 no-go zones as violence spreads across France, really emanating from Paris. Is we back to 68 again, Martin?
No, you've got the same sort of problems we've had in this country in 2011, which is very disadvantaged youth are rebelling against police brutality. And, of course, they don't always rebel in a civilised fashion.
So, yes, of course, they won't be doing that. But why is the significance politically in France? We've got elections coming up this year, haven't we?
Well, it may be that somebody trying to manipulate this situation, but I'm afraid the discontent that it represents has been festering for decades.
Are the French more likely to do this sort of thing than the British? Is their temperament different, or
what? Well, the kind of writing that we're seeing here is not by students; it's by unemployed, disenfranchised urban youth.
OK, what do you make of the assassination this week, apparent assassination of Kim Jong-nam, who openly criticised the North Korean regime? Well, they say he did. But why, if he has been assassinated by the North Koreans, would it have been done in Kuala Lumpur? That sounds a bit strange, where they couldn't control the body, etc.
Well, I do not know is my simple answer to that. But of course, they did fire their rocket into the Sea of Japan while Trump was schmoozing with Shinzo Abe, so because they knew that was the way to get some attention, like a 3-year-old.
Apparently, this chap was smothered by a woman in a miniskirt. She put a cloth up to his face, possibly some sort of nerve gas in the cloth. What on earth could this be?
Well, I don't know, Tony, but the Malaysian police should investigate thoroughly. Don't forget that Malaysia has often been the target for Western...
But, what do you make of them saying it's North Korea that's done it? It just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Well, it's possible that the North Koreans have done it, but if you don't investigate the event, it could be that somebody's done it to discredit the North Koreans, the South Koreans, perhaps, the Americans. You've got to carry out a police investigation. OK, time to sign off for the Murdoch News at 7. Coming up, Arabian Nights with Mohammed Makawi. Thanks to our guest in the first hour, Lib Dem Councillor for Hengrove and Whitchurch Park, Tim Kent. Our sister show Dialects on BCFM at noon on Tuesday. Our show page for your comments is thisweek.org.uk. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling, wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable BCFM weekend. Billy Quain tomorrow, 10 a.m. till 12, and Danny Lopsh at 8 on Sunday evening. Do please join us for the Politics Show at the same time next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down.
From the Sky News Centre at 7, the White House has denied reports President Trump's considering using troops as part of a clampdown on people in America illegally.
There is no effort to utilize the National Guard to round up unauthorized immigrants. I don't think you can be any clearer than that.
That's Press Secretary Sean Spicer responding to claims up to 100,000 military personnel could be mobilised. The Associated Press news agency says the idea has been floated in a leaked memo. Tony Blair has been criticised for urging pro-Europeans to rise up and persuading those who voted to leave the EU they were wrong. In a speech in London, the former Prime Minister claimed people voted without knowing the terms of Brexit. The driver of a bin lorry which crashed and killed 6 people in Glasgow has admitted reckless driving in a separate incident. Harry Clark was caught driving a car 9 months later, despite having had his licence revoked. The UKIP leader has apologised to his party's members for comments on his website about the Hillsborough disaster. Paul Nuttall had claimed close friends were among the 96 Liverpool fans who died in the tragedy, which he has since admitted is not true. But he's dismissed speculation that he lied about being at the game in 1989.
I take the blame for the fact that I failed to check what was put up on my website in my name. That is my fault. I apologise. But I do not apologise for what is a coordinated, cruel and almost evil smear campaign.
Unilever has rejected a takeover bid from the owner of Philadelphia Cheese and Heinz.